So I'm actually really excited to hear about this topic myself. I'm honored to introduce Maya Shetreat Klein, MD, who's a neurologist, herbalist, urban farmer, and author of The Dirt Cure, Healthy Food, Healthy Gut, Healthy Child, which has been translated into 10 languages. She has been featured in the New York Times, The Telegraph, NPR, Sky News, and The Dr. Oz Show, and many more. Board certified in adult and child neurology as well as pediatrics, Dr. Maya completed the University of Arizona's fellowship in integrative medicine and now serves on the faculty. She works and studies with indigenous communities and healers in Ecuador. In her book and her practice, she offers an integrative and spiritual approach to allow moving beyond chronic health problems in children and adults. She also founded the Terrain Institute, where she teaches terrain medicine, an earth-based program for transformational healing. And as you have questions at the end, please make sure you go up to the mic so we can hear you. And please give a warm welcome to Dr. Maya Shetreat Klein.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. All right, so let's get started. I want to just start, and I always like to start this way. If you just take a moment, close your eyes, and just imagine in your mind, what does a healthy child look like? And just observe, as your eyes are closed, what are the qualities or characteristics of this child that makes you think this child is healthy? You can open your eyes and just tell me, like you can just call out what in your mind's eye kind of came up as this is a healthy child. What was the quality? Active, engaged, joyful, clear eyes. Great, good. So a lot of times when I ask people about what is healthy, what does that really mean, especially health professionals, I get sort of this answer of, well, not sick, like, so if you're not sick, you're healthy. And, that is not totally inaccurate, but I would argue that health is not just the absence of disease, and it's not just a reflection of whether we face stressors or show symptoms, because there is an argument that someone who actually has illnesses and fights those illnesses could be healthier than someone who never gets any illnesses, never has a fever, right? And that's what I see in a lot of chronically ill kids, is that they're really never getting sick in the way that we think of as like kind of a finite, you get sick, you get better, but instead it's sort of this prolonged kind of like never really totally sick, never really totally better. And it's not just a function of lab results, right, or measures. So, like, I've seen kids that like they have all normal labs, but they're having all kinds of degenerative problems, right? But if I looked at their CBC and I looked at their chemistry and their thyroid function, I would say, well, these kids are healthy, but they're clearly not. So I would argue instead that health really manifests as resilience. Okay? So what is resilience? What does that mean? Resilience is the ability to bounce back. Okay? And from a medical standpoint, we talk about this concept of homeostasis, right? The ability for our bodies to stay in balance. And that's because stressors are inevitable. Okay? Like, we will always face stressors. Children, in fact, must face stressors, whether it be, injuries or it be infections or other kinds of illness. That is a stressor is actually necessary in the process of building that resilience, right? Because how are you going to get strong if you never have to make any effort to get there, right? And what I would really say is, like, if you want your child to learn how to play the violin, and every time they take out the violin you slap away their hand, Or you hire someone else to come and practice the violin for them, and they never get to practice the violin, then what's going to happen when it's time for them to stand up and play the violin in front of everybody? They're not going to know how to play the violin, you know? And so you need to have this opportunity. The practicing is hard, it's stressful, whatever it might be, but you need that. And in this case, the immune system needs that, and the body needs that, and the brain needs that. So we know that the incidence of chronic disease is rising in children. And when I first went into practice, this was really, truly kind of the way I saw things was, you know, I walked in and saw 4 or 5, 6 medications, you know, on the list for kids that were 6, 7 years old, 8 years old, and sometimes they were several neuropsychiatric kinds of, you know, or neuroactive medications. But even now, like, you know, I might see a kid and the parents will say, oh, like, my kid's healthy. And then when I find out what the medication list is, it would be like steroid cream for their eczema, and allergy medication, you know, for their, like, antihistamines for their allergies, and asthma medication for when they need the asthma medication, their inhaler. And then they might, you know, be taking Miralax for their constipation, and maybe they're going to be on, you know, a stimulant for focus. That might be someone who's taking 5 medications. Maybe you'd be like, you know, an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old, and that parent will say, my kid is healthy. They're healthy. Because we've sort of really shifted this idea, this kind of pharmaceutically based chronic illness sort of model has now become like the new normal. And so people just think like, oh, this is normal. Like when I was a kid, and I realize that was not very recent, but when I was a kid, you know, if someone was on 5 medications, they would be considered sick. You know, we would all say that's like a kid who's sick, and now kids could be on 5 medications and they're healthy. So chronic disease actually, it results from this lack of resilience. Okay, and there's actually science behind this, which is this is from Bob Navio, who's a wonderful mitochondrial and metabolic researcher in at UC San Diego. He runs actually the Mitochondrial Metabolic Center there, and he's just been in the news a lot because of this Suramin study. Has everyone know about that? The Suramin study for autism, where this is like a very old parasite medication actually that Bayer made, and it's actually very cheap because its patent's gone forever. And basically, he was giving it to children with autism and seeing they became verbal, and basically saw many of their autism behaviors and characteristics reverse for a temporary period of time, and they needed to have it redosed. So this has actually been all over the news, and there's just an article in the Wall Street Journal about it, in fact, like this week, maybe in the last couple of days. So this is a study he did that he published in 2014 about the cell danger response. And I think this really illustrates the science of resilience, right? That this cell danger response is an evolutionarily conserved metabolic response that protects cells and hosts from harm. There's a chemical, biological, physical threat, I would even say maybe emotional threat of some kind that the body perceives, and the body responds, the cells respond, and the cells can't maintain that balance. It exceeds the cellular capacity for homeostasis. Okay? That's part of why you have the flu, for instance, and you feel terrible, right? It's partly because of the virus. It's partly because your cells are diverting their resources from making you feel good. They're kind of going into like a kind of less than optimal function in order to divert resources to dealing with whatever inflammation and things that need to happen in order for you to recover from that infection. So after this danger has been eliminated, okay, your cells did their job, and your body did its job, then there's all these nice anti-inflammatory and regenerative pathways that kick in and reverse the cell danger response, and you heal. But sometimes the cell danger response persists abnormally, and then it disrupts your body metabolism, it disrupts your microbiome, and all kinds of sort of dysfunction and suboptimal function then follow, right? Behaviors change, chronic disease results. And in his paper, he proposes in this model that this is probably the driving kind of explanation for all chronic illness, you know, whether it be ALS and Parkinson's, autism, all of these different things. And this is actually comes from Russell Blaylock. These are drawings that he did because he is a multi-talented person. That sort of shows how this cell danger response happens in the brain. Okay, and because I'm a neurologist, I'm extra specially interested in the brain. But you know, here you have this cell danger response. It activates microglia in the brain, and there's a lot of data now that shows that most neurologic conditions, most chronic neurologic conditions, are driven by acute microglial activation. So if you ever want to know anything about why the immune system, what happens in the immune system, or even the gut can have a huge impact on the brain, because we know now that there's this gut immune brain connection, which I write about in my book, The Dirt Cure. Basically, this is modulated to a great extent through microglia. Microglia are like immune cells, but also really nurse cells in the brain in a 3-to-1 ratio with neurons. So we have many more microglia than neurons. So here's what happens. You have this activation of some kind. It activates the microglia, okay? They go from nurse cells, taking care of the neurons and doing all these nice, yummy things, to mama bear. Okay? And in the process of this mama bear mode that they go into, they start releasing cytokines and chemokines and excitotoxins, and it's a very inflammatory situation, which actually also damages the neurons too on some level. Okay? There's some small amount of damage that happens in that process. And then there's a lot of free radical generation, right? So there's this whole kind of sequence of events where there's peroxidation and there's mitochondrial dysfunction and there's this immunoexcitotoxicity with all this free radical generation. So that's why there's some damage to the neurons. But then this cell danger response reverses, okay? The microglia go back from being mama bear to nurse cells again, taking nice care of the neurons, releasing all these yummy growth factors like BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, creates all these nice connections between neurons again, and a lot of reparative effects, okay? All right, so we've established that resilience is important. Health, basically, in order to be healthy, you need to be resilient, and that there's actually science behind this idea, right? And then I would say, taking it a step further, that health reflects the relationship between internal terrain and external terrain, okay? And bear with me, because we're kind of going to get to the point here in a moment. Internal terrain is your microbiome and your organ systems, gut, skin, lung, immune, and on and on. External terrain is soil, air, water, seeds, plants, animals, and other living organisms, germs and microbes, synthetic compounds, right? All the other kind of toxins and different things that we encounter as well. Okay, so what I would say, and the point I want to make here, is that everything is connected, right? And we have become, you know, where we have this idea that we can kind of attack these things, we don't like those things, but we want these things. And what we're finding is that the more we try to push things away that are in nature, that our bodies want to be exposed to and need to be exposed to, we have all these sort of unanticipated and unintended consequences. Okay, so John Muir said, and I was just in Muir Woods the other day, actually, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. Okay? And I like this idea very much, particularly because we're talking about germs and microbes, right? So we'll get to that in a moment. But gut, immune, brain, endocrine, all are linked together. Okay? And this idea that there's one thing that's separate from all the rest is artificial. Okay? Microglia, as I just said, are immune cells in the brain. So our brain has its own immune system. Tonsils and Peyer's patches and antigen-presenting cells are part of the immune system of the gut. And in fact, in the gut makes more neurotransmitters than the entire central nervous system. Okay? And then we have the sympathetic dominance, where we see increased inflammation. So like sympathetic dominance is the fight or flight part of the nervous system, and that ends up driving and activating the immune system. It creates inflammation because the vagus nerve actually, in the parasympathetic nervous system, that rest and digest part that balances out the fight or flight, that actually, in the same way that it modulates your respiratory rate and your heart rate, it also is modulating the level of inflammation in your body. Okay? So think about this. I mean, there's so many ways that all these different systems are linked together. And then there's other ways too, like that everything's connected. So microbial health is connected with soil health, and soil health is connected with plant health, and plant health with animal health, and then plant, animal, and ecosystem health is related to human health. Okay? So I just find it very funny sometimes because I, practice integrative medicine, and I meet a lot of other integrative practitioners that are my colleagues and I think are really smart, great healers. But at the same time, they can kind of make these recommendations where it's sort of still like thinking inside this little, inside this tunnel of it doesn't matter if you're living in this place where you're doing nothing to take care of your soil, you're never getting outside, your water is polluted and all these different things. We're just going to give you supplements and different things, but we have to realize that we are part of our environment. We're very, very connected to that. And if we're not thinking about that relationship and we're not in relationship with the world around us, then we are not going to be able to be healthy. Right? If you have sick water and sick soil and sick plants and this kind of model, then how can you be healthy all by yourself? Right? So we need to be thinking about how we're connected and the relationship that we have, and that's actually a very important part of having a healthy immune system. Okay? And so for me, the way I wrote my book, called it the dirt cure. No, I don't believe dirt cures in that way, but I think dirt is a good way to kind of talk about resilience, okay? Germs and microbes, soil and what grows in it, which is food, okay, and plants, time and nature. These are the three foundations to me of, I think all could be described as kind of dirt in their way, and I think these are the foundations of resilience and therefore the foundation of health. So germs. People ask me, what's the difference between a germ and a microbe? And what I say is that germs are really a pejorative term for microbe. Okay? We used to think bacteria were really bad. And now we know that there are good bacteria. People still like to talk about good and bad bacteria. I'm going to get to that in a moment. But the point is that it's all in how you see it, right? So actually our bodies are mostly microbes. This upsets some people, but it happens to be true. And actually, the microbiome, which is the 3 to 5 pounds of our body made up of organisms, of these small microscopic organisms, help control brain development, brain function, and behavior. They are part of what's important in behavioral abnormalities related to autism. They actually are related also, along with diet, to the way our genes end up expressing themselves and whether we are able to, whether we end up expressing cancer or not in our bodies, which is really not something that's a given, but something that we're constantly in relationship. Even in that way, cancer cells, and I don't know how many people know this, we make cancer cells in our bodies all the time. And our immune system, having a healthy immune system, the immune system identifies those cells and gets rid of them. That is basically another kind of way that we're in balance, right? In the same way we're in balance with bacteria and different kinds of organisms, we're also in balance with these abnormal cells that pop up. And basically, again, for all of these things, it has to do with your body and how in balance it is, your immune system, and how resilient it is that it can identify those things and get rid of them. The microbiome is even important in things like multiple sclerosis. So there's this study which shows that people with MS have higher levels of certain bacteria in their microbiome and lower levels of others compared to healthy, quote-unquote healthy people, and that actually these microbial changes correlate with the activity of certain genes that are important in the immune system, right? And multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune condition. And actually, the medication used in these people with MS compared to those who are untreated, the medication seems to normalize gut microbiomes or have some impact or some relationship in normalizing the gut microbiome to make it more like those people who don't have MS. Okay, and when I was in my training, people would say, like the MS doctors would actually, we don't know exactly why these medications, these immune modulating medications seem to help people with MS, but they do help some portion of them, and so therefore we give these medications. And it turns out, this is actually a pretty recent study from 2016 that showed that that it's modulated through the gut microbiome in some way. And in fact, this was just literally in Scientific American last week. Gut germs appear to play a role in multiple sclerosis. Are probiotics for MS next? This is mind-blowing stuff. Okay? And we have this whole new concept now of psychobiotics. Anyone here hear of psychobiotics? So psychobiotics are basically looking at the science of probiotics that have direct impact on brain function, mood, okay, anxiety, depression, etc. It could be behavior. It could be, other ways basically that our nervous system is impacted by our flora, our gut flora, and our body flora. Okay, so now they are, and when I say they, it is pharmaceutical companies are developing products to come to market that will impact the brain through flora, through bacteria, through different kinds of organisms, many of which actually come from soil. All right, so we have challenges to our microbiome, though. And what are the challenges? Well, our flora is different, okay? And that's partly because of things like how we give birth or how we're born, okay? C-section babies are more likely to have their gut seeded with skin flora, as opposed to the perineal flora, right? Like the mom's vaginal and perineal flora, if they're born vaginally. That changes their gut flora. It may normalize over time, but there's a window period where a lot of things are happening, a lot of development happens in that early life, and so it impacts things differently. And that's why we know that babies born by C-section can have different risk factors or for certain kinds of chronic illness. Doesn't mean that they will have it, doesn't mean if you're born vaginally, you're home free, just risk factors. Formula feeding versus breastfeeding is a conversation that could be this whole talk, really. There's incredible, incredible science around how breast milk basically changes the immune system. It's from the prebiotics, which are these components that don't feed our body, but instead go feed only very specific kinds of flora that can only live on that kind of exact non-digestible for us or for the baby compounds, so that there are bacteria that come in, colonize just during the time the baby's breastfed, that protect the gut, that make the gut not leaky. Okay, because babies naturally have leaky guts that protect them in a very particular way. As soon as the breast milk's gone, those bacteria are gone. So there's this very protective effect that happens. There's parts of the breast milk that actually called microRNA that find their way in and basically connect directly to the gene transcription factors for the immune system. There's all kinds of ways actually that breast milk is incredible. So being fed by formula there are great reasons sometimes to formula feed. I'm happy that we have the possibility to do that. However, it definitely changes the immune system of the baby and the microbiome. Chronic use of antibiotics. So I have people come to me, I'll say, any health problems? No. I always ask, how many times has your child been on antibiotics in their life? And if you ask that question to people, I've gotten a lot of no more than normal, and I wrote about this in my book, No More Than Normal, and I say, well, what if I told you that some people never go on antibiotics? They say, well, probably 4 or 5 times a year. So that could be in a 7 or 8-year-old, right? We're talking about 30 or 40 rounds of antibiotics in their life. So it can be dramatic sometimes, and that is going to impact the gut microbiome. things like Tylenol and ibuprofen and steroids, those obviously are going to have an impact in various different kinds of ways. Vaccines and other pharmaceuticals. We have something called a microvirome. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And the microvirome is the viruses that make up part of our microbiome. And we don't know how vaccines impact that part of the body, right? We don't know because nobody is looking at that. So that is another way that our bodies are different. Processed food and pesticides. So processed food, obviously, because it is nutrient depleted and not very biodiverse, our bacteria don't like that very much. And so we'll have less diverse flora in our guts. Pesticides, actually, like Roundup, which is in a lot of genetically modified foods, which are many, and not just genetically modified, but like certainly, I mean, it's used now actually on wheat, you know, basically right before the wheat is harvested because they want to have a bigger harvest. They douse it in Roundup in order to kill the wheat so it releases the seeds and they get that bigger harvest. And then the seed goes straight to whatever it's going to be used for, the wheat, which is, you know, then eaten by us. So we're getting traces of Roundup. Roundup was first patented as an antibiotic. So basically we're getting a lot of trace antibiotic in our food. And then too much time indoors, right? We're on screens. We're much more, you know, there's a lot more sort of fear of stranger danger. Like when I was a child, I spent hours and hours out and about by myself. Cell phones weren't a thing, so I didn't have a cell phone. I just had to be back by the time it started to get dark, you know, and that's what I went. There was a creek I liked to play by myself, where I would be, not just always by myself, but I would just be out and about and doing my thing, and I'd come back when it was time to eat dinner. So, you know, that it's rare now to see kids who are able to do that. And I mean, I could talk a lot about the kind of mental, emotional, and even spiritual kind of effects of being able to do that and how important that is for development. But physically, it makes a difference to our microbiomes. So our health paradigm right now is avoid, 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 avoid. Okay? But our bodies crave complexity. And we thought we were going to have this magic bullet, right? Like we were going to do we were going to figure out the gene for autism and the gene for ADHD and the gene for all these different chronic illnesses. But it turns out there's no gene for that. There's just no gene. Okay? We've spent billions of dollars to basically find that out. And really what our bodies crave is complexity, biodiversity. And I would argue that is the magic bullet, the new magic bullet. And the biodiversity that our bodies need to be healthy comes from our terrain. And there's a reason for this, because there's a reason that babies start out developmentally by crawling on the floor and putting everything in their mouths. It's because they need to have a biodiverse microbiome. This is how we have evolved to survive. And for some reason, we think that we then need to douse them in antibacterial soap and wipes and do all these things, and we can't let them do this, you know, which is what they really, really need to be healthy. And, you know, we all, I think, know about Louis Pasteur and the germ theory, which, you know, was diseases are caused by microorganisms. These small organisms are too small to see. They invade our bodies, and their growth and reproduction can cause a disease. Okay. He had a colleague at the time, Claude Bernard, who said, actually, most microbial diseases are caused by organisms present in the body of a normal individual. And we know that that's actually probably true now, right? Most microbial diseases, okay, are caused by organisms that are present in our bodies, like strep. Strep's in our bodies. I would argue most of the organisms, including viruses, that we might actually experience infection, that might cause us to experience infection, actually are already present in our body. I would even maybe include spirochetes in that. Basically, these become cause of disease when disturbances arise that upset the equilibrium of the body. So what he's saying is that the host, and the balance and health and healthy immune system of the host is what actually makes the difference between health and disease, not the germ. It's not about the germ or the microbe, or at least not exclusively. But our paradigm is changing, right? So now we have probiotics. Think about this. Like, let's say, for those who were around at this time, 15, 20 years ago, if you would have gone to your doctor and said, oh, I'm taking 3 billion colonies of bacteria in a pill every day, they would be like, you're crazy. Now we're the ones recommending that. Okay? The microvirome and oncolytic viruses I'll talk about in a minute. Soil-based organisms, this is a new kind of probiotic, but new but old, right, kind of probiotic where soil is very biodiverse and we're making probiotics from it. Nematode therapy, right, parasites on purpose. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Fecal transplant. Who here has heard of fecal transplant? Okay, so see, this is really mainstream now. And fecal transplant is so successful at treating certain things, like Clostridium difficile is a infection that people who are immunosuppressed are susceptible to, and elderly people in particular who actually can die when they get it. I think about 10% of elderly people who contract C. diff die because it is refractory to a lot of antibiotics. It's resistant. And now fecal microbial transplant is so effective at treating it that there was a study a year or two ago I don't remember if it was in the Netherlands, but it was in Scandinavia. And they actually had to stop the study because they said it was unethical not to treat with fecal microbial transplant. It was so effective at saving people's lives. Vaginal microbial transfer is actually something that's being used now in C-section babies where in academic centers, women are having vaginal fluids from their body basically wiped on the face and the mouth and the skin of their babies that are born by C-section as a way to try. I don't think it is the same, but I think it shows that we are now, as a medical community, as an academic medical community, acknowledging the importance of biodiversity in the microbiome. So most people have probably heard of the hygiene hypothesis. And basically, it was from a study in New England Journal of Medicine that said kids who grow up on farms are about 30 to 50% less likely than other children to develop asthma. So everyone said, okay, because they're dirtier. Well, so there were researchers in Europe who said, okay, is this really true? Like, are there really more bacteria? Is that what it is? And they went and compared in an urban apartment versus on a farm, how many bacteria are there? And they found out it was actually pretty similar. There were bacteria, equal amounts, but the difference was what? Diversity. Okay, so there were many more kinds of organisms if you were on a farm. And that was what made the difference in that risk of asthma. And this study is actually published in Nature a few years ago now. And it was really, I think, a landmark study. We have, basically what they found was in mice that were germ-free, meaning they were antibiotic treated, and so they didn't have microbes in their gut. They were given virus, this murine norovirus, and those mice who had the murine norovirus actually preserved their guts, the health of their guts, even though they were germ-free. So normally, if you have antibiotics, it changes how your gut is functioning. A lot of things break down. A lot of things happen not in a normal way. And with the murine norovirus, this enteric virus basically replaced the function of the commensal bacteria in the gut so that basically everything went without a hitch. Bacteria were gone, viruses took over. So this really tells us, because we thought, okay, some bacteria are okay, but viruses are bad, right? No. We have viruses that are doing really important things in our body and in our gut. What else do they do? Well, I don't know if this has been discussed already so far, but there's actually some fascinating stuff out there about how having viruses in childhood can impact your immune system for the rest of your life. So if you had mumps as a child, you are half as likely to get ovarian cancer later in life. So mumps, especially pre-pubertally, is actually not a very risky illness. But we've made it out to be like it's something horrible now, right? The medical community is like mumps is, a horrible thing. I mean, I didn't have mumps. I'm sure it's very uncomfortable. But if you are not, so post-pubertally, there are some side effects that, some issues that can come up with fertility in boys and things like that. But pre-pubertally, it only seems to be an uncomfortable illness in childhood and then potentially cuts your risk in half of having cancer. At first, it seemed like an association, but actually these researchers I don't even know how they actually got this published, but they went on to find that there are antibodies, right, because certain ovarian cancer cells look basically similar. They have similar antigens to those antigens that are found in mumps. So basically, the virus teaches the immune system to attack ovarian cancer cells because of what I said before. We're always making cancer cells in our bodies, but our immune system has to just be dealing with it, and that's a way that it does, through viruses. There's also some really interesting data right now about oncolytic viruses. So measles virus can, and in certain cases it's a modified measles virus now, that actually is being looked at as a way to and effectively address things like glioblastoma multiforme or pancreatic cancer, or kinds of cancers that are very difficult to treat. Injecting into it this measles virus, this oncolytic measles virus, seems to be in some cases very effective, and it's being looked at in academic centers. So our relationship with viruses is more complicated than we thought, and maybe more beneficial than we thought. Parasites, okay, well we know, so bacteria could be good, viruses maybe could be good, but are you telling me parasites? Parasites are nasty, parasites are gross, and we want to always get rid of parasites, right? So now we're starting to see that parasites also may benefit us in certain ways. So in this study of 260 almost Aboriginal adults, they found that about 36% of them had prior infection with this kind of intestinal worm, Strongyloides, and that about 51% of them altogether had type 2 diabetes. But what they found was those who had had the previous infection with the Strongyloides were 61% less likely to develop type 2 diabetes. Okay? And we see there's just a reduced risk. We don't know exactly why, but there's another study that actually came out that shows, again, it's an association, but an interesting one, where in the top, in A, okay, that is where type 1 diabetes is in high incidence, okay, and in B, where it's red, that is where there's a high daily burden of parasites. So people are more likely to have parasitic disease in those areas, and in the areas in A, they are more likely to have type 1 diabetes, and they are almost mirror images of each other. And it's been looked at actually even further, though, not just as associations, but being looked at now as a way of treating inflammatory bowel disease. And in this study, in the conclusion, the researchers wrote the relationship between humans and nematodes of the gastrointestinal tract, those are worms, can be considered as a mutualism rather than a typical parasitism, and maybe in the future used as an alternative therapeutic model. Okay, we're talking about parasites on purpose. This is looking at biodiversity in celiac, okay? And basically here we have this in A, okay? This is pre-treatment with hookworm. Okay, people with celiac disease in this academic setting were given hookworms. They were infected on purpose with hookworms. When they were infected with hookworm, you can look at B, and you see that the way those dots kind of went up the not the curve, but higher up, okay, that is increased biodiversity, increased richness of organisms in the gut. This is not just parasites. They were only given hookworms, and yet diversity begets diversity. So parasites were introduced, and all kinds of other organisms decided they wanted to go hang out in the gut before they didn't want to. Okay? And we know now, right, biodiversity is really important for having a healthy immune system. And having a healthy immune system is really important for resilience. So here we know that being exposed to all these different organisms is actually incredibly important. Soil and what grows in it. Okay, this is the second part. I'm just going to grab my phone because I don't actually just want to keep an eye on what time it is. Okay. Okay. 2015 was actually the International Year of Soil. Nobody knows that because nobody cares about soil. But this was actually the UN and World Health Organization were looking at that. So soil is actually incredibly complex and important for our health. 1 teaspoon of soil holds as many organisms as people on the planet. That's probably the best probiotic you can be exposed to. An estimated 25% of the world's biodiversity is in soil. There's actually this study that I presented a couple of years ago. I was asked to present what I thought the most important health study or scientific study for human health was in the past year on a panel for a huge audience of doctors and healthcare practitioners. And this was the one I chose because I thought it was amazing that Nature, this premier scientific journal, was talking about how soil biodiversity is critical for human health. It's coming out as one of the really important factors in us being healthy. So food is the embodiment of our terrain. We eat animals and plants. Animals live on plants. Plants live on soil, sun, water, and rocks. And the microbes and mycorrhizae actually facilitate nutrition for plants and therefore for us. So here we are in this complex, very connected relationship. And nutritional depletion makes us vulnerable to chronic illness. So if I'm talking about in this, right, this track is about having a healthy immune system, the first part of having a healthy immune system is being exposed to lots of germs of all kinds and organisms. The second part is actually, right, so with that builds up our resilience. The second part of being resilient is having the tools to have a healthy immune system. That comes from our food. And our food comes from our soil. Soil is important for more than one reason, but that is one big reason. Okay? Reserve is key. You need reserve. You need to have the ability to, okay, like an example of this would be your car breaks down. Okay? If you don't have any money in the bank, then you and your car repairs $4,000, okay? This is going to be it's like bad news that day. And you have to drive to get to work. Well, maybe there's no way for you to get to work if you don't have a car and you can't afford that repair, then you might not be able to keep your job. And then, like, everything's going to kind of break down from there, right? You don't have a job, now you don't have any more money. Like, what are you going to do? Okay? Until you find the new job and whatever. That could be a while. If you have money in the bank and you can pay for that repair right away, you go back to work, everything hopefully goes off without a hitch, and, you know, it sucked, but now you're good again. Okay? If you don't have that nutrient density, you don't have that reserve in your body, then when things break down, you're going to be in trouble. And so we need to have that nourishment in order to have the reserve. And nutrient density is an important factor in creating resilience. And nutrition is many things. It's macronutrients, it's micronutrients, it's also phytonutrients, right? The things that make cranberries red and grapes purple and things like that. It's microbes, it's stem cells in the food, in the plants and fruit. It's pheromones, it's little traces of soil, okay? And there's other important parts to the quality of food. These eggs are actually from my chickens. I keep chickens, and I live in New York City, not in like downtown New York City. I have like a little green space, and I keep chickens. And that was because I wanted to know that my chickens were out in the sun and getting to have outdoor exposure and have a nice life and eat, you know, the soy-free organic food. They actually, I think like my eggs probably are like, would be $15 a dozen if I priced it out. But you know what? It's okay because, I mean, they make a lot of eggs and actually because like I have a relationship with these creatures that are making my food. That's my chickens, and that's their hen house and run, which is nicer than my house, actually, I feel like. And those are their yolks, which are really, really orange, you know. And if you're used to just regular old supermarket eggs and you're not going out of your way to get the special stuff, you know that the yolks don't look like that. And that's because pastured eggs can have 3 to 6 times more vitamin D than confinement and 10 times more omega-3s. Okay, and they're a concentrated source of choline, which is crucial for the brain and many other things, and lutein and zeaxanthin, which protects the eyes and the colon and other things. Cholesterol, contrary to popular belief, is critically important for brain health and immune health. Cholesterol levels are actually lower in people with the autism spectrum disorder, people with depression, people who have violent behavior, and people who are suicide completers. And in this large study, it was actually a meta-analysis of 19 studies looking at more than 68,000 deaths. Low cholesterol, not high cholesterol, predicted an increased risk of dying from gastrointestinal or respiratory illness. Choline is critically important for brain health. And when pregnant rats are given choline, their pups are smarter. Researchers can identify which their pups are because they're the smarter ones. And that's not just true when they're babies, but even when they're elderly, they still are smarter. We know, I think all, that omega-3s and even omega-6s, these essential fatty acids, are critically important to lower things like ADHD, cancer, learning disabilities, mental illness, seizures, and asthma. And if you eat pasture-raised dairy, eggs, or meat, you will have higher levels of omega-3s than if you don't. And that changes in just 4 weeks. Eating conventional meat will lower your levels over 4 weeks. Eating grass-fed meat will increase your levels over 4 weeks. So it makes a difference. Raw milk is another thing which has been pretty much maligned, but we have technology now to make sure that we're not contaminating and, you know, doing these things which can be an issue but are rarely issues. But we can know, you know, that we can know by doing testing on a regular basis, and most farms that sell raw milk have to do that. In this study of 1,000 babies and mother pairs studied for 1 year, those that drank raw milk had 30% fewer fevers, respiratory infections, ear infections, and lower blood inflammatory markers. Another study showed fewer allergies and less asthma and hay fever in those children who drank raw milk. This was all done in Europe, by the way, because it could never happen here. But these are the studies. There's the pasture study. This was the one done in Austria, Finland, France, Germany, and Switzerland. Over the first year of life, okay, getting raw milk. And in this study, the Gabriella study was the one that showed lower childhood asthma and allergies. Okay, eating vegetables, fruits, spices, all parts, different colors, right? Brussels sprouts, broccoli sprouts are critically important actually for detoxification and turning on our detoxification pathways and also increasing brain plasticity. Bitters are critically important for immune system health in the gut, in the lungs, in the ear, nose, throat. Stabilizes blood sugar levels, which actually reduces inflammation and enhances detoxification. Bitters are things like coffee, hops, and beer. So a lot of people like bitters, actually, okay? Just because adults will people will look at me and be like, bitters, ew. Yes, there are bitter tonics. Coffee is actually a bitter tonic, but there are also bitter tonics you can take. There are companies that make really great bitter tonics, and I prescribe them all the time. But also like orange peel, okay? Just try to get organic because they can be heavily sprayed. Dark chocolate has bitter compounds. These alkaloids do really important things in our bodies. Even our brains have bitter taste receptors. Dandelion, organic dandelion root tea is something that I like to have people drink. It's very nutrient dense and it also is a great bitter. Chamomile is a mild bitter, great for children. And sweeteners, on the other hand, because sugar, in the way that bitters actually upregulate the immune system, sweeteners actually shut down the immune system. So when the sugar receptors are activated, the immune system tends to be shut down. But at least if you're having sweeteners in moderation, you want to be having the kind that are nutrient dense. Okay? So you don't want processed white sugar or corn syrup or even agave nectar. Okay? The way it's processed means that it doesn't have nutrient density, but you might want raw cane sugar or raw honey or maple syrup or blackstrap molasses, which actually has incredibly powerful antioxidant properties. And I'm going to close just talking about the third component of dirt, which is time in nature. So soil organisms I talked about before make us happier, less stressed, and smarter. And this strain, Mycobacterium vaccae, has been studied quite a lot. This oncologist used it in cancer patients and found it improved their emotional health, vitality, and cognitive function. Another person looked at it in mice and actually found that it lowered their stress levels physiologically and behaviorally. And finally, it was looked at when it was given. I love this study because they gave it on tiny peanut butter sandwiches to the mice. And basically, these mice navigated a difficult maze twice as fast and exhibited half of the anxiety behaviors as the other mice. So these soil organisms, which they say you can be exposed to by gardening or being outside, and it gets in little cuts in your hand, or you inhale it a little bit, or you put it in your mouth, right, like here and there. Sunshine. I just want to mention this part of time in nature because a lot of people really fear being in the sun. And while I will say that being sunburned is not something that I recommend, and I think there is a problem with being sunburned, there is this study, 2014 study, that was looking at 30,000 women over 20 years. This is a very statistically powerful study, found that women who avoided sun exposure were twice as likely to die for any reason during that period of time as those who didn't. And this risk was considered to be similar to smoking. Avoiding the sun with like all your being, which many people do. Now, for some people, being in the sun, maybe they can only be in the sun for 5 minutes a day without getting burned, or maybe they can be in the sun, only after 5 p.m. or whatever it is. But not going outside because of sun is actually probably not going to help your immune system. And I don't think that this is just because of vitamin D, but of course we do know that vitamin D is a really important modulator of the immune system as well. And actually, just on the side, nearsightedness seems to be related not just to having the ability to look at, far distance versus staring at screens all day, which it does seem that does have an impact, but in fact, being exposed to full spectrum light for at least 3 hours a day. Full spectrum light, meaning sunshine, natural light, is what helps prevent developing nearsightedness. And nature also enhances healing. So patients, not just children, but patients who post-surgically looked at trees out their window versus looking at a brick wall, had shorter post-operative hospital stays, lower scores on their post-surgical complication scale, fewer negative notes in the nurse's chart, and actually needed less strong analgesic intake. Also, it reduced pain and anxiety for people who were having dental procedures just looking at pictures of nature. Nature also improves focus. So these children who play on highly natural school playgrounds versus turf or that kind of thing will have fewer attention and concentration problems and improved cognitive and physical functioning as compared to those who don't. That's powerful. I don't know what drug does that. And actually even perform better on standardized tests when they're exposed to green spaces. I don't like standardized tests, but if you want to see your children functioning better in general and able to achieve better scores in general, exposure to green spaces will improve that. And I don't know who here has heard of Shinrin-yoku or forest medicine, but actually it's been studied in Japan quite a bit because it's part of Japanese culture to go immerse yourself in the beauty of the forest. And there are a lot of ways it seems to actually improve human health. And that can, from mood, it improves sleep, it improves focus and executive function, right? So all these different things that it seems like it could, makes you just feel happier. But also, it increased natural killer cell activity, okay? So this is immune function. And increased expression of anti-cancer proteins. So it's actually modulating just being in the forest, and that could be the microbiome exposure. It could be how you feel. It could be the spiritual connection you have with the trees. It could be feeling awe. It could be being relaxed. I mean, it's all the different things probably. It's probably not just one thing actually makes you less likely to get cancer. It's modulating your immune system in measurable ways. So basically, what I will say is, expose yourself to dirt. You want to eat it through your organic or biodynamic produce. And in California, you are blessed to have so many options. Avoid power-washed vegetables and fruit. Prepare and cook foods with peels if they're edible, if hopefully they're organic or biodynamic. Grow your food in it, okay, and eat from pastured animals if you're eating that. Nourish your soil, okay? So try to compost and mulch. Avoid the chemical fertilizers and pesticides. I know I am preaching to the choir here. Don't, I don't know if you have leaves you need to rake here. I live on the East Coast, and people are like leaf blowing all the time, and then they put it all in plastic bags and take it off to landfills. I mow my leaves after I spend a long time admiring them, because I love how dead leaves look on the ground. We mow them, and then we leave them through the winter for the earthworms to eat. And so they can make the soil rich. And then playing in the dirt. So don't go on turf. If you have a choice, play sports on fields, okay? Turfs are basically made of toxic, it's basically industrial waste. So turf is like the worst. And, again, I'm sure this is preaching to the choir, but these are all the things you can do really to increase your exposure to dirt. And that is what's going to give you a healthy immune system. So I'll say our choice is between this and this. And that's my dog. He likes the dirt cure too. Thank you very much. And I don't know if I have time to take questions. 5 minutes? Okay, so 5 minutes to take questions. I'll keep my eye on the time, if anyone has any. So the question is, are intestinal worms potentially something that can help with inflammatory bowel disease? So this is something that's being explored in academic studies. I don't recommend going out and infecting yourself. Sometimes when I've given talks like this, people have actually raised their hand and said, do you recommend I go do that? So no, I don't. But I think that there's definitely growing scientific literature that shows that in some way it can be helpful. And the best way to do it, I think, is really important, because I've actually had families in my practice who have, gone off and gotten intestinal worms, or they've on their own sort of decided to try these different ways. And sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, if someone doesn't have a healthy immune system, they can grow out of control in your body. So you don't want to, and especially in a person who's already immunocompromised in some way, to then challenge them in a way that their body can't manage. So I think it really does have to be done with care and with supervision and things like that. And so, but I do think that, yes, there is a way that intestinal worms do modulate our immune system in our guts, that can be helpful and strengthen the immune system. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.